Good evening. We are here tonight to tell you about a murder that took place over 400 years ago. It was the murder of a London shopkeeper named Master Beach and his young servant Thomas Winchester by one of their neighbours. Master Beach was a prosperous man, his shop was popular, and he sold enough to make himself very comfortable. But in London in 1594, not everyone's lives were so comfortable. The city was overcrowded and ever-growing, flooded with immigrants from the provinces and refugees from abroad. Master Beach's neighbour, Thomas Merry, was a young man who owned a tavern, but he struggled to make ends meet and to feed his family. In a fit of jealous rage, Thomas Merry killed Master Beach by hitting him repeatedly over the head with a hammer. To get rid of the only witness to his horrific crime, he then did the same to Master Beach's young servant. He forced his sister, Rachel, to help him clean up the blood and get rid of the body. In the days that followed, his neighbours, horrified that such a horrific crime could take place in their close-knit Southwark community without being detected, banded together to find out the criminals. They discovered Merry, and Merry and his sister Rachel were hanged for murder. The crime sent shockwaves across Elizabethan London. It was reported in news pamphlets and sung about on the streets. But sadly, none of those pamphlets and none of those ballads survive today. The only reason that we know that the crime took place at all is because it survived in another form. In 1600, the Admiral's Men, the theatre company that staged many of Shakespeare's early plays, staged a play called The Tragedy of Thomas Merry, based on the crime, at the Rose Theatre, the remains of which can still be found on Bankside. In the following year, the play was published, or a version of this play was published in a compilation of 2 plays in one called Two Lamentable Tragedies. A few weeks ago, Freya and I staged the first performance of this play in over 400 years. Freya took the gory and unpleasant role of Thomas Merry, the murderer.
And Emma took the part of the on-stage prompt. She was there all dressed up in costume, sitting in the middle of the stage while the action took place around her, just as it would have done in Shakespeare's London. Now, this is quite peculiar. We don't do that today. When you go to the Globe or the RSC, you don't see the person sitting there with the book, the script, on stage, ready to pick up the pieces when things fall apart. So why do we do this? Surely actors should be able to learn their lines.
Well, it was because we were attempting to bring to life the ways that plays were staged in Elizabethan London. So the actors, because they performed so often, never received a whole script to learn. They only had their own lines and their cues, and they only had one full rehearsal on the day of the performance. So that's what we attempted to do.
Now, as you can imagine, for a cast of modern 21st century actors trained in weeks and weeks of rehearsals, knowing everybody else's lines as well as their own, this was quite unsettling. We were pretty worried about what was going to happen. I was on stage as the murderer. I knew that I killed somebody, and I knew what I did with the body. I didn't know what anybody else was going to do in reaction against me. So this is why we had Emma there. And we were trying to do it to make some connections between actors in the time of Shakespeare and how we do modern day acting. We were trying to experience what it was like, what it felt like to be those people in 16th century theatres. But those weren't the only connections we were trying to make. We were also trying to link what happened in London in the 1590s and then around about 1600 in the text of our play with our society today, and we were exploring some of the problems that we face. Conceptions of society. David Cameron suggested that we have a big society. We were looking at social inequality and injustice, gender relations, poverty, and how people deal with criminals when they're living in their family or in their neighbourhood. So the play starts with Thomas Merry, pretty disgruntled, sitting at home, considering his life. And he says, I cannot buy my beer, my bread, my meat, my coals, my faggots, and such like necessaries at the best hands, because I lack the coin, which many misers coffer up in bags, having enough to serve their turn besides. He's essentially saying that he can't buy the food and drink he needs for his family. He can't afford to heat his house. He can't do it all at the same time. And he certainly can't buy the quality that he wants and feels his family deserve, because he just can't afford it. He also takes a look around at the people living in the nearby streets, and he sees men who are very rich, men like Master Beach, who've got more than enough money. They've got plenty in savings, and he thinks that this isn't fair. Now today, in England, we have more people than ever accessing food banks. We also have food banks increasingly providing food that doesn't have to be cooked. People just can't afford to turn on their ovens. And you don't need to look very far in the papers to see evidence of fuel poverty, particularly among the elderly. And of course, if you can't afford to heat your home in a cold winter, then you're going to be subject to all kinds of diseases. And this is bad, and it puts a strain on the NHS. So we wanted to explore these kinds of connections. We wanted to see what happens when you've got a situation where the society is in crisis. The 1590s were a terrible time. England was at war, prices were very high, the currency was debased, inflation was terrible. A series of really bad harvests and plagues meant that everyone was really, really struggling to make ends meet. So we took a little look at this, and we thought that actually what we see is Mary turning to crime out of desperation. And this is pretty much what we saw in 2011 when London's youth took to the streets in the riot. It's what happens when a city's young people become poor and disenfranchised.
So as Freyja says, Mary turns to crime out of desperation and sad economic circumstances. But in so doing, he doesn't just embroil himself in a criminal lifestyle, he also forces his sister, Rachel, to be involved by making her help him hide the body and clean up the blood. Rachel is determined to protect her brother, and she says, "Let others open what I do conceal. He is my brother, I will cover it, and rather die than have it spoken rife. Look where she goes, betrayed her brother's life." So Rachel is saying that Mary might be found out, but it won't be through her. She would rather die than have the whole community know her as someone who would turn her brother in to the authorities. And in studies of British gang culture today, we see a similar pattern. Sisters who were loyal to their criminal brothers, partly out of family pride and loyalty, and also because they're financially dependent upon them. In one recent study by London Metropolitan University, one sister of a gang member said, "My brother brought me an iPad recently. I thought to myself, he doesn't work, so where does he get this money? I chose not to ask. I can't be bothered with an argument. Just take it and be quiet. I don't want no argument." Rachel finds herself in a similar position, forced to keep quiet about the money her brother has stolen. As an unmarried Elizabethan woman, Rachel is unable to support herself. She's entirely reliant on her brother for financial support. For the sister of the gang member, she has a job of her own, but she becomes dependent on her brother for luxuries that she cannot afford. The shadow of domestic violence hangs over both accounts. Both Thomas Merry and the gang member are men who live violent lives, and their sisters are afraid to provoke them. But there is also the issue of family pride and loyalty. Rachel is determined to protect her brother and her reputation, and many of the sisters in the study were the same. They were determined to conceal their brother's secrets and protest their innocence. Although not criminals themselves, the family members of criminals can become complicit in crimes by being forced to keep quiet about them, and so become embroiled in their devastating consequences. For Rachel, the consequences of keeping her brother's sister's secrets were fatal. She was hanged as an accessory to murder.
Now, it's quite a gory tale, and the way that Merry disposes of the body is no different. He kills Master Beach, and he's got to do something with the corpse. But he can't carry the body all by himself, and Rachel's not going to help him. She's just going to wipe up the blood. So what Merry does is he chops the body up into its, component parts, as one, I suppose, might do in such a situation. He chops the head and the legs off, and then the arms and the torso are separate. And he puts these pieces in bags, which he carries around London and deposits in certain secret locations. He goes home convinced that this means he's out of trouble. No one can possibly put two and two together, or head, legs, arms, and torso together. No one is going to find him out. He hasn't banked on the local neighbourhood watch, or the equivalent in Elizabethan London. The neighbours all get together. They don't know where Master Beach has gone. Something bad must have happened. Thomas Winchester is lying there with a hammer in his head. This is how he's been murdered. So what they do is they look in all the drains to see who's been washing blood away. They try and find out who owns the hammer that is sticking still in Thomas Winchester's head. And they try and find out who bought the sacks in which the body parts are concealed. We have the character of a gentleman. He's out walking his dog, and the dog happens to find something lying in a ditch. It's a bit of the body. The gentleman has heard a rumour that someone is missing in a certain location in Southwark, so he takes the body parts to the locality where the man is missing. We also have two watermen, here in their orange life jackets. These were the men who ferried passengers across the River Thames. There was only one bridge in this time, so they were really important. And they were the equivalent of today's London cabbies. They're the people who get the gossip from their passengers, so they know something is wrong and Master Beach is missing too. They come across the other body parts lying in a different ditch. What do? They feel a sense of social responsibility. They could ignore them, but they take them along to the street where Master Beach lives. And the neighbours band together, they lay out the body, they see that it makes a hole, they see it's Master Beach, and they use the body parts to come to a conclusion about who murdered him. Now, this idea of neighbours all getting together to help step in when something is wrong, to fix it, is very like David Cameron's Big Society. David Cameron in 2011 first spoke about this in terms of our society and community being broken. Something needs to be fixed. And what he was talking about is the way that people living together in neighbourhoods manage to police themselves. Things work because people care about each other, and you don't always need the state to step in and do it for you. This is precisely what happens in Elizabethan London. In the 1590s, there is no standing army and there is no police force. There is no way the law is going to be upheld if the ordinary people don't get together to do it themselves. They only need state justice right at the end when the execution is performed. And so in the connections between what we see happening in Elizabethan London, this idea that you represent it on the stage to show people how they should be acting when something goes wrong, Mary has stepped outside the social norms, the neighbours have put it right, we can see traces of what David Cameron sees as the ideal for our society today, a sort of fantasy, as you like, where we see the world of the 1590s still being played out in today's political rhetoric.
So, as Freyja says, the play deals with fantasies and nightmares of a society, how a society can go wrong when neighbours start killing each other, but how that same neighbourhood can fix it. And it is similar ideals that we find in newspapers and political speeches today. But of course, in many ways, Elizabethan London was very different to the London we know today. The water was unsafe to drink, so everyone drank weak beer from morning till night. Plague was rife, and there was extremely serious consequences for breaking the law. The law often punished dissent with death. But many things have not changed all that much. There was destructive prejudice against immigrants. Women who walked the streets alone, particularly at night, were at risk of sexual violence. And there was dramatic social injustice stemming from inequality of wealth. Many things have improved since then: sanitation, gender relations, the NHS, the welfare state. But many things have not, and we think it's important to recognise this.
And it's in analysing these similarities and differences that we find in literature and we find in history. Similarities and differences between the past and the present, we might track them with our left hemisphere, that we can start to see how you can use the past to help to make the world a better place today. We might think that we're all very modern, that we've got problems to do with investment bankers. The world is a progressive place, and we tend to look forwards rather than back. We're using science and new technology to see where we're going to go. But unless we stop and look back over our shoulders, we're not going to learn lessons from the past, lessons that will help us to improve. We're not going to work out what we did wrong. We're not going to work out how we got where we are today. And sometimes those things really matter. We also think that the reluctance sometimes to invest in the humanities might come from its previous focus on slightly more traditional subjects. History has often been about great men. Literature has been about great works of art, the plays of William Shakespeare. But those people aren't really like most of us. They don't reflect the hopes and the anxieties of the ordinary people. And we think that it's by looking at these ordinary people and exploring how their lives were lived and how they dealt with their problems that we might be able to think about who we are today and how far we've improved on what went on in the past. So we like to look through things like the tragedy of Mary at the lives of the people out there on the streets of London. These are the poor people, the uneducated people, the disenfranchised people. And in the 1590s, this pretty much includes all women in society.
We're not suggesting that the study of the arts and humanities only matters when it's relevant to issues our society faces today. I believe that the study of literature and history are important in their own right, and I don't think I'm alone in this. The recent birthday celebrations of Shakespeare's 450th birthday and the spate of programmes, events, and various articles inspired by the anniversary of the First World War suggest that big history and great literature will always be seen as important. But The Tragedy of Mary is certainly not great literature. In fact, a lot of it is quite bad. And the crime on which it is based is certainly not big history. It's tiny history, micro history. It mattered to a small community of people in 16th century London, and then it was soon forgotten.
But for those few people in 16th century London, it was really important. It said something to them about their society, their community, and how they lived together. And we think that if we focus on tiny histories, we're going to get more of a sense of who you and I are and how we all work together in today's England, today's Britain, today's global joined-up world. And so if you take one thing away from our talk today, we'd like it to be this: that we want to spend a bit more time thinking about the past in terms of ordinary people. You, me, everybody. Not just, I don't know, David Cameron or the Queen, not just William Shakespeare or Queen Elizabeth I. So we'd like to think about the past, and we'd like to think that the past matters because it tells us something about who we are. It tells us something about how we got where we are today, and quite a lot of the time it tells us how far we still have to go. Thank you.
Thank you.